In the early 1990s in England, a woman called Sarah Thornton was sentenced to life imprisonment for killing her abusive partner. He was an ex-police officer, and she'd called his ex-colleagues several times, but no action was ever taken. In fact, on one occasion, he punched her in their presence so hard that her feet left the floor, but still they did nothing. One night, her husband came home very drunk and behaving aggressively towards her. Terrified, she barricaded herself in the kitchen and waited until silence fell. She hoped he'd fallen asleep, but taking no chances, she armed herself with a knife and quietly opened the door. Needless to say, he was waiting for her, and in her panic, she stabbed him, and he died, despite her calling an ambulance immediately. At the trial, the judge ruled that she could not enter a defence of self-defence because her response was disproportionate. He was only using his fists, whereas she used a weapon. Another potential defence was put forward of provocation, which was also overruled for the frankly jaw-dropping reason that the threat was not immediate. Apparently, the time during which she was barricaded in the kitchen, she should have calmed down. You can almost hear the unspoken dear. The judge, however, was using case law, and the criteria that he was using was set in case law, and this prevented him from allowing a defence of provocation because the time which elapses between the provocative act and the response must be no longer than it would take the average man to run 200 yards and fetch a sword. This is just one example of how historically the law has been developed by men for men, and most laws pertaining to violence have naturally then taken a very male-centric viewpoint, designed around their own experiences of mostly public violence, into which women's experiences of violence, overwhelmingly experienced in private at the hands of men they know, has struggled to fit. So the criminalising of coercive control in England and Wales, in Scotland, and recently here in Ireland and no doubt elsewhere, is a huge victory, albeit expressed in gender-neutral terms. And the reason that it's a victory is because it is criminalising something that is overwhelmingly experienced by women. Even when men do experience domestic violence, it's far more likely to be what Johnson's typology has classified as situational couple violence, rather than the intimate terrorism to which women are subjected. And the reason that coercive control is experienced overwhelmingly by women is because by its very nature, it draws upon women's subordinate position in society. So what do we actually mean by coercive control? Well, because I do a lot of training and you have to have a lot of sound bites, my favourite Reader's Digest version is that it is actions by the abuser which either literally or metaphorically shrink the world of the victim. It then follows that our interventions must make the victim's world bigger again, what Dr. Liz Kelly has called space for action. In coercive control, abusers deploy a broad range of non-consensual, non-reciprocal tactics over an extended period to subjugate or dominate their partner rather than to merely physically hurt them. Compliance is achieved by making victims afraid and by denying them basic rights, resources and liberties without which they're unable to effectively refuse, resist or escape. Coercive control then is the very opposite of the ties that bind us, the title of this section. It isolates, it diminishes, it robs the victim of their personhood, it eats at their soul, and it is far, far more cruel than a punch in the face. And it is also far more dangerous. Compliance with coercive control is underpinned by what Dr. Evan Stark calls the or-else proviso, and is therefore fear-based, but is often not violence-based. The fear of violence is often long-standing and often reflects non-violent as well as violent forms of coercion. And of course, abusers have privileged access to information about their victims, and thus they can target their particular vulnerabilities. The major elements of coercive control, of course, do include physical and sexual violence or coercion, but also threats, stalking, other forms of intimidation, isolation, degradation, and control. The most commonly cited forms are exploitation, treating their partner like a servant, deprivation, depriving their partner of money, food, transport, or other basic resources, and regulation, micromanaging how they spend their time, how they dress, clean, shop, or care for the children. Danger to the particular victim is continuous, and this is one of the things that is absolutely paradigm shifting about coercive control, because it forces us to stop looking at discrete incidents and to look at the entire pattern to which women are subjected. Some coercive control tactics are criminal acts when they're considered separately. Some, like surveillance or taking somebody else's money, are only illegal when they're committed against strangers, but not always when they're committed against partners. But many of the tactics used in coercive control seem relatively harmless when they're viewed in isolation, and they only take significance when they're viewed as a pattern. Other behaviours designed to make a partner feel crazy, for example, hiding their cell phone or moving a car from a regular parking spot, or other examples of gaslighting, seem merely cruel or perverse. But when they're taken together with everything, they create an experience of entrapment that's hostage-like. Victims are repeatedly demeaned or made to feel crazy in a context where they're too fearful or too dependent to respond in kind. They come to doubt their self-worth and even be overcome by self-loathing. The rights and liberties which are denied in a situation of coercive control include the right to dignity, personhood, and autonomy. The victim is caught by a combination of fraud and deceit, often disguised as love, and literal constraint. And although the feeling of being trapped is a psychological state, it's not all in their head, but a reflection of the reality of literal containment achieved through financial deprivation or restrictions on travel or social relationships, as well as their genuine fear of actual or threatened physical and sexual violence. Abusers often also demonstrate omnipotence by claiming to know their partner's thoughts or their whereabouts, and exercising control both by order and implication over the minutiae of daily living. In the mind of the victim, the abusive partner becomes larger than life, both figuratively, in that he seems to have more power over her than anyone else she knows, and literally, in that he seems to be indestructible. This is often unwittingly reinforced by agencies, sometimes by taking no action, so it appears if nothing or no one can stop him, and sometimes by putting pressure on her to leave, the unspoken message being that he's too powerful for us to do anything about, we can only make you change. The old model of viewing domestic abuse as largely about physical violence has outlived its usefulness. Even as we expanded the definition and added in other forms of abuse, it was still true that in most instances, physical violence was seen as the real abuse. Think, for example, how many times you've seen leaflets urging women to be aware of the warning signs, which on closer examination proves not to be descriptions of warning signs, but actual abuse, just not physical. Or the number of times you've seen professional case files with just a verbal, no further action. So even though in theory the definition of domestic violence has included more than physical violence for some time, in practice it has proven not to be so. And this is where coercive control comes in, turning everything on its head. It's not, as many seem to think, just one more form of psychological or emotional abuse. It's the very essence of domestic abuse. It truly encapsulates women's experience of being trapped by an abuser who uses tactics which the state has handed to him because of the historical, and some might even argue current, second-class status of women. In particular, the tactics of humiliation and degradation tend to be enacted by abusers targeting areas of gender identity from which victims get their self-respect or self-esteem. It's no accident that almost all abusers sing from the same song sheet. You're useless, you're ugly, no one else would want you, you're putting on weight, you're a terrible cook, a terrible mother. Because these are areas of gender identity, sexual attractiveness, a good homemaker, a wonderful mother, that women are indoctrinated from birth that they must make a success of if they want to be valued. Indeed, the script that abusers use is so predictable that in the early years of me working in this area of work, I had paranoid fantasies about the existence of an abuser's manual that they were all secretly sharing with one another. It eventually dawned on me that there was indeed an abuser's manual, but it isn't a secret, it's mainstream culture. Coercive control is not just about psychological abuse, it's entrapment and the denial of freedom. And that means that we have to move away from a focus on injury as our model of calculating harm and towards a focus on freedom. And that too moves us into thinking differently about domestic abuse and what an effective intervention looks like. It is not, as has been the tendency in recent years in the UK, enough to focus on safety from, which is how I would characterise things like risk assessments and MARACs, but the freedom to, which is equally important. Without this dual focus, which is what a coercive control lens requires, we end up rescuing women from physically dangerous situations, but without equipping them with the resources and skills that they need to rebuild their lives and expand their space for action. Recent government figures out only just a couple of weeks ago from England and Wales show that just under 1,000 cases have now been prosecuted under the new coercive control law. There was also a piece of research that came out looking at domestic violence homicides, showing that although there was a history of physical violence in approximately half of the homicides, there was a history of coercive control in 92% of them. So that means that coercive control is a far better indicator of dangerousness than physical violence. To be fair, in the UK, the training of police and prosecutors is still ongoing, but the small number of early successful prosecutions for coercive control is a little disappointing. But that only applies if we're saying that the sole measure of success is convictions. And I would argue that we need to be thinking about other criteria too. If it makes women aware at an earlier stage that what they're experiencing is abuse, if it changes the conversations about domestic abuse in the wider culture, then that too is a success. Imagine a world where you were never asked again, why doesn't she just leave? Or even better, what about the men? I know that if I gathered together a random group of women and asked them what behaviour is acceptable in a relationship, it would be extremely unlikely that there wouldn't be unanimous agreement that physical violence was not acceptable. But as soon as you start moving into other forms of non-physical violence, forms of abuse, the unanimous stance starts to crumble. That makes physical violence the deal breaker, which is far too high a bar. That should be the baseline. Surely we can do better than that. One of my favourite t-shirts says, consent is the baseline, hold out for enthusiasm. So we shouldn't underestimate the impact that criminalising this behaviour can have in women feeling confident to both name it as abusive and to declare it as unacceptable. We were greatly aided in England and Wales by The Archers, which some of you may be aware of, which is a hugely popular radio soap about rural people, which made gaslighting and other elements of coercive control of Helen by her husband Rob a long-running theme, over a year in fact. Unable to withstand his relentless tormenting, she eventually snapped and stabbed him. She was arrested and charged. The story made the front page of the tabloids, and a fundraising page put up in her name raised nearly £200,000. When she was tried and acquitted because of the history of Rob's abuse, prominent juries, government officials, media figures, and even the Prime Minister's office offered supportive statements. And this has been hugely helpful in bringing the concept of coercive control into the everyday conversation in the UK. The long journey to making the law reflect women's experiences and to changing the wider social conversation about relationships and acceptable behaviour is not yet complete. But we have made and continue to make positive progress towards a world where true freedom and liberation for women can occur. And I believe that the consequence of that will also be the liberation and freedom of men. And that's what we're here today to kind of dream of, and that's the tie that binds us. Thank you.